Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to talk about this video's sponsor, Magic Spoon. Magic Spoon offers high-protein, no-sugar cereal and treats for breakfast or even snacks to fuel your day. Magic Spoon cereal is packed with 13 to 14 grams of protein, 0 sugar, and 4 to 5 grams of net carbs in each serving. Their treats offer 11 to 12 grams of protein, 1 gram of sugar, and 1 to 2 grams of net carbs, and they have no artificial ingredients. They are a great way to have a guilt-free breakfast or snack that fits a variety of diets. Personally, I love breakfast. It's always an important meal for me. Sometimes, due to tight deadlines or pressure from work, I cannot always take the time to eat what I want. With Magic Spoon, I can grab a simple, high-quality breakfast or snack with no artificial ingredients. Magic Spoon cereal comes in multiple flavors, including cocoa, peanut butter, fruity, and frosted. I really enjoyed the frosted and fruity flavored cereals. Their treats come in multiple flavors as well, including chocolate and peanut butter, marshmallow, blueberry muffin, and double chocolate. So pick up Magic Spoon today for a simple, high-quality, high-protein breakfast or snack. Use my code PWPMTG or click the link in the description to try Magic Spoon cereal or treats today and get $5 off. You can also find Magic Spoon on Amazon or in your nearest grocery store. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it is backed with a 100% happiness guarantee online. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. So click on the link in the description and go to magicspoon.com/PWPMTG or scan the QR code on the screen for $5 off. When you support our sponsors, this helps bring you more content just like tonight's game. So thanks again to Magic Spoon for sponsoring today's video. Tonight we are joined by members of the Howling Salt Mine podcast. They are an awesome group who talk about Magic the Gathering in fun and informative ways. Be sure to check out their podcast in the links below. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First we have Sam from the Howling Salt Mine piloting Marath, Will of the Wild. This deck seeks to control the board with its commander, keeping opponents from building up their board state. It then tries to win with either an infinite mana combo or with Cryptic Trilobite. Next we have Zeb piloting the Master of Keys. This deck seeks to win with a number of one-card win conditions like Hoarding Broodlord, Tidespout Tyrant, or Omniscience. It can also use its commander to recur valuable enchantments from the graveyard. After that we have Tony from the Howling Salt Mine piloting Nixilis, Captive Kingpin. This deck seeks to use its commander to gain massive card advantage. It then storms off with a number of cards and closes it out with either Dualcaster Mage or commander damage. Finally we have Mike from the Howling Salt Mine piloting Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. This deck seeks to get ahead on mana through the use of its commander. It then tries to win the game with either a Reanimator strategy or an Aristocrat style loot. This video would not be possible without all of the support of all of our sponsors, including viewers like you on Patreon. If you want to support this content, be sure to check out the links below. You can also support us for free by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment below. Without further ado, let's kick off this typical tyrannical typecast tyranny. Sam had the most red balloons and gets to start us off. Sam draws a card for turn and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts a Tarian Soul Cleaver and passes the turn. Zeb draws and plays a Tundra. He casts a Mystic Remora and passes. Tony draws and plays a Badlands. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He ships the turn. Sam draws and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to activate Urza Saga, creating a construct. Sam passes. During its upkeep, Zeb pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays an Ottawara, Soaring City as his land for turn. He passes. Tony draws and plays a Blazemire Verge. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Ragavan. Zeb takes it, Ragavan triggers, Zeb exiles an Underground Sea, and Tony creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts an Arcane Signet. Remora triggers and Zeb draws. Tony casts Springleaf Drum and Zeb draws again. Finished up, Tony passes. Mike draws and cracks his Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He plays a Swamp and casts his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Mike ships the turn. Sam draws and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Soul Ring onto the battlefield. He plays a Savannah for turn. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Delny, Streetwise Lookout. He activates Soul Cleaver, equipping it to his construct. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with his construct. Mike takes 3 and Sam ships the turn to Zeb. During its upkeep, Zeb pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Watery Grave into play tapped. Zeb ends his turn. Tony draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with Ragavan. Zeb takes it, Ragavan triggers, Zeb exiles a Seagate Restoration, and Tony creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Tony plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Nixilis, Captive Kingpin. He cracks 2 treasures, floating mana. Tarian Soul Cleaver triggers, and Sam's construct gets 2 +1/+1 counters. Tony casts Imperial Recruiter. Lotho triggers, and Mike loses a life and creates a treasure. Nixilis triggers, gets a +1/+1 counter, and Tony exiles All Will Be One from the top of his library. He sighs, then Recruiter enters, and Tony fetches up a Razorkin Needlehead into his hand. Tony passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Godless Shrine into play tapped. He passes. Sam draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle for turn. He casts Cutsil, Malamed Exemplar. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with his construct. Mike takes 5, Cutsil triggers, and Sam draws a card. In his second main phase, Sam activates Soul Cleaver, equipping it to Cutsil. He ships the turn. During his upkeep, Zeb lets his Remora die. He draws and casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Windfall. He casts Spellseeker. Lotho triggers, and in response, Mike casts Path to Exile, targeting Ob Nixilis. Tony raises a massive protest, but it falls on deaf ears. Ob Nixilis is exiled, and Tony fetches up a swamp onto the battlefield tapped. Then Mike loses the life and creates a treasure through Lotho, then Spellseeker resolves. It enters, and Zeb fetches up a Culling the Weak into his hand. Zeb passes. Tony draws and plays a Seer Step Pathway for turn. He recasts his commander, Ob Nixilis. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Ragavan. Mike takes it, Ragavan triggers, Mike exiles an Imperial Seal, and Tony creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts Razorkin Needlehead. Lotho triggers, and Mike loses a life and creates a treasure. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Tony exiles a Gemstone Caverns. Tony gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws, Razorkin Needlehead triggers, and he takes a damage. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Tony exiles a Lotus Petal. In his main phase, Mike casts Agatha's Soul Cauldron. In response, Zeb casts Force of Negation for his alternate cost, exiling a blue card. Cauldron is countered and exiled, and Mike follows up by playing a Witch Blessed Meadow into play tapped. Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Zeb casts Path to Exile, targeting Cutsil. Lotho triggers, and Mike loses a life and creates a treasure. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Tony exiles a Blood Pit. Then Path resolves, Cutsil is exiled, and Sam fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield tapped. The turn moves to Sam. Sam draws, Razorkin triggers, and Sam takes 1. Ob Nixilis gets a counter, and Tony exiles a Final Fortune. In his main phase, Sam plays a Bountiful Promenade. He casts Eladamri's Call. He fetches up an Evolution Witness into his hand. He casts Evolution Witness. Lotho triggers, and Mike loses a life and creates a treasure. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Tony exiles a Mox Opal. Sam taps Ancient Tomb to activate Soul Cleaver, equipping it to Evolution Witness. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. Everyone realizes that this is an infinite combo, so in response, Zeb casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling LED. Finished up, Sam passes the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and takes a damage through Needlehead. Ob gets a counter, and Tony exiles a Simian Spirit Guide. In his main phase, Zeb casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Spellseeker as an additional cost. Soul Cleaver triggers, and Evolution Witness gets a +1/+1 counter. Witness triggers, and Sam returns Urza Saga from his graveyard to his hand. Then Zeb adds 4 black. He casts Persist. Lotho triggers, and Mike loses a life and creates a treasure. Ob Nixilis gets a counter, and Tony exiles a Vampiric Tutor. Then Zeb returns Spellseeker from his graveyard to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter. It triggers and dies immediately. Cleaver triggers and gets a counter. Witness triggers, but there is no permanence in Sam's graveyard. Then Zeb fetches up a Cabal Ritual into his hand. He casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He casts Hullbreaker Horror. He casts Imperial Seal. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, and Zeb bounces Ob Nixilis back to Tony's hand. Then Zeb fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Zeb passes. At the end of Zeb's turn, Mike cracks 4 treasures, floating 4 black. Soul Cleaver triggers, and Witness gets 4 +1/+1 counters. Mike casts Ad Nauseam. Ad Naus resolves, and Mike reveals a Beseech the Mirror, Dothy Voidwalker, Enlightened Tutor, Touch the Spirit Realm, Exotic Orchard, and an Orzhov Signet, deciding to stop there. Now with the tools he needs to stop Tony, he has no further actions, and the turn moves to Tony. Tony draws and casts Mox Opal from exile. He casts Lotus Petal from exile. Lotho triggers, and Mike loses a life and creates a treasure. Tony recasts Ob Nixilis. He casts Lightning Greaves. He activates Greaves, targeting Ob Nixilis. In response, Mike cracks 2 treasures, floating mana. Soul Cleaver triggers, and Evolution Witness gets 2 +1/+1 counters. Mike channels Touch the Spirit Realm, targeting Ob Nixilis. Ob is exiled, and Tony follows up by casting Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Ragavan. Mike blocks with Lotho. They both die, Tony moves to his end step, and Ob Nixilis re-enters the battlefield. The turn moves to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike casts Enlightened Tutor. He fetches up a Walking Ballista onto the top of his library. He draws and takes a damage from Needlehead. Ob triggers, gets a counter, and Tony exiles an Unstable Amulet. In his main phase, Mike plays an Exotic Orchard for turn. He casts Orzhov Signet. He casts Walking Ballista where X equals 1. Mike passes. Sam draws and takes a damage from Needlehead. Ob triggers, gets a counter, and Tony exiles a Lion's Eye Diamond. In his main phase, Sam casts Generous Patron. Patron enters and triggers twice due to Delny. Sam puts a 1/1 counter onto Razorkin Needlehead, Hullbreaker Horror, and 2 counters onto Imperial Recruiter. Generous Patron triggers 8 times through Delny, and Sam draws 8 cards. Razorkin triggers 8 times, and Sam takes 8 damage. Ob Nixilis triggers 8 times, gets 8 counters, and Tony exiles a Red Elemental Blast, Culling the Weak, Pyroblast, Beseech the Mirror, Firebrand Archer, Luxury Suite, Mox Amber, and a Gamble. Next, Sam plays a Stomping Ground into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Marath, Will of the Wild. It enters with 3 +1/+1 counters. He convokes Court of Calling where X equals 2. In response, Mike cracks a treasure. Soul Cleaver triggers and Evolution Witness gets a 1/1 counter. Mike casts Silence. Silence resolves, locking out opponents from spells this turn. Then Cord resolves, and Sam fetches up a Nightshade Peddler onto the battlefield. It enters and Soul Bonds to Marath. He activates Soul Cleaver, equipping it to Marath. He activates Marath, removing a counter and pinging Ob Nixilis for 1. Since Marath has Death Touch now, Ob Nixilis dies and Tony sends it to the graveyard. Soul Cleaver triggers and Marath gets a 1/1 counter. Finished up, Sam passes, discarding to hand size. Zeb draws and takes a damage through Needlehead. In his main phase, Zeb casts the Master of Keys. Hullbreaker Horror triggers and Zeb bounces Evolution Witness back to Sam's hand. Master resolves and Zeb escapes Mystic Remora from his graveyard. Hullbreaker triggers, targeting Marath. In response, Sam taps Ancient Tomb to activate Marath twice, targeting the Master of Keys and Hullbreaker Horror. Both die, then Marath bounces back to Sam's hand. Remora resolves and Zeb passes to Tony. Tony draws and casts Reanimate, targeting Ob Nixilis. Remora triggers and Zeb draws a card. Needlehead triggers and he takes 1. Reanimate resolves, Ob Nixilis enters, and Tony loses 4 life. He casts Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Remora triggers and Zeb draws again. Needlehead triggers and Zeb takes 1. Ob triggers, gets a counter, and Tony exiles a Soul Ring. He casts Beseech the Mirror from exile, sacrificing Springleaf Drum as a bargain. Remora triggers, Zeb draws, Needlehead triggers, Zeb takes 1, Ob triggers, gets a counter, and Tony exiles a Wheel of Fortune. With no other actions, Beseech resolves. Tony fetches up a Walking Ballista into exile, casting it for 0. It resolves and dies immediately. He activates Soul Cauldron, exiling Walking Ballista. He activates Walking Ballista's ability on Ob Nixilis through Soul Cauldron, pinging an opponent. Ob triggers, gets a counter, and he exiles another card. He presents a loop of activating Ballista's ability, pinging an opponent, and getting the counter back through Ob's ability. He does this over and over, until the table is dead, and Tony wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a fun game tonight. Congrats to Tony on his win. He was able to push through over and over despite the frequent disruption of his commander through his opponents. Once the time was right, he cast his commander, executed his combo, and closed out the game. The most valuable card in tonight's game, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Razorkin Needlehead. Once this card hit the battlefield, it guarantees damage and triggers through Ob Nixilis. Over and over again, it was chipping away at Tony's opponents, giving him massive advantage. Even when Sam had a huge swing with his generous patron, Needlehead allowed Tony to match his advantage right back through Ob Nixilis. A big thanks to the Howling Salt Mine for playing with us in tonight's game. Be sure to check out the links in the description below and follow them for more content. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.